Okay, welcome to our lesson on international trade. So international trade is kind of an interesting topic. There's very few topics where you'll see economists so overwhelmingly agree on a question as should trade be freer across countries, or the well-being of society would be higher if trade was freer across countries. I mean, there's a lot of questions that economists overwhelmingly tend to agree upon but as far as trade is one of the biggest ones. So economists are usually one of the most vocal proponents for free trade. The reason is the analysis we're going to go through on how trade should make everybody better off. Now, many citizens, oftentimes a majority in various cultures, in various societies, wish to either close trade down completely, or oftentimes it's not close trade down completely, but put in many restrictions on trade, restrict trading for one reason or another. So what we discuss in this section really was we go through the idea of why does trade make people better off, but we also do talk about what are the criticisms of free trade and what are the instances when it could be harmful. There are some cases where trade can lead to negative outcomes. Usually, it's if it's partially implemented, and then we'll get to it. But there are times when it can be, it can lead to harm. So why trade? I'm guessing if you just think about it briefly, all of these should make sense, right? Why would you make trades with other countries? Well, your country might lack vital resources that could be obtained by other countries. Maybe you have something about your society that makes it efficient at producing something, but inefficient at producing other things, right? That could be a really good reason for trade. Specialization could permit larger outputs and offer economies of large-scale production. And number 4, this isn't really an economic reason, but countries that trade together, that rely on each other for products, are certainly less likely to fight each other because, well, you don't want to lose the products. The U.S. certainly doesn't want to go to war with countries in the Middle East and lose access to oil. And trust me, those countries definitely don't want to lose the money we're paying them for that oil. Right? There are some incentives to try to get along when this happens. So gains from trade, like without looking at any of our analysis, without doing any graphs, any numbers, the question, right, if you're doing a trade, nothing new is produced. So by definition, does that mean one side has to be better off while the other side is worse off? And the answer, of course, is no. And the reason the answer is no is without even doing anything else, the trades that we examine are voluntary. Each side has to think, by making this trade, I am better off than if I didn't make this trade. So by default, anytime you have a trade, both sides must be better off. And the reason both sides are better off is everybody has different values for different products. Or if you're in a country that can make a lot of one product, as we know, there could be the last unit you produce, there's likely a much lower value than some of the first units, and other countries may not have much of that product at all, so they may have a much higher value, and makes trade very, very easy to see winners on both sides. Very, very simple example, the school lunch example. Jack and Jill are in the cafeteria. Each get the school lunch. There's a raisin cookie included in a little cup of applesauce. Well, one of them, that's what they each get. One of them doesn't like raisin cookies, one of them doesn't like applesauce. So they make a trade, right? They're both happier after that particular trade. They get rid of something they wouldn't have eaten anyway, got something they like, both sides better off from the particular trade. So as far as why trade is studied, within the United States, of course, products are traded across states all the time. I mean, just daily, hourly, every minute, there's trades between people in one state or another. If you've ever bought anything off of eBay, probably not buying it from the people in the same state. And there's no issues, there's no restrictions at all with trade within the United States. Now, why would there be issues then with trade across countries? Well, there are several things that can make trade across countries a bit trickier. One is political factors. Sometimes there will be reasons, restrictions on making particular trades. You do have to deal with multiple currencies often if you're buying something from somewhere else, right? If you buy products from somebody in the UK, well, they're on the pound and the British pound, and we're on the US dollar. You have to do some conversions first. Or if it's many of the countries in Europe are on the euro. Many countries in Europe aren't on the euro, though, and they're on their own separate currency. You have to figure out, you have to do that exchange first. You can't necessarily move labor as easily. Often products can be bought and sold pretty easily from, say, Europe. Or, if you want to buy something from Great Britain, often that's pretty easy. But if you want to work in Great Britain, that is not, right? There are restrictions to working in other countries that often are tough to get around. There's restrictions to working in the U.S. that can be difficult to get around as well. So impediments to moving labor and capital, right? You recall land, labor, and capital. Capital are the products that are used to make other products. Often there are impediments to moving capital across countries as well. So between political factors and restrictions, multiple currencies, impediments to move labor, you can have some issues. So if you are dealing with domestic trade, like within the United States, it's all one national government. But if you're dealing with trade across multiple countries, multiple national governments, a lot of countries have trade agreements in place where you could buy or sell things without tariffs or quotas. But there are tariffs and quotas still in place. And a major problem you see with international trade, or a major restriction that's put in place, are tariffs and quotas. A tariff is a tax on an import that comes in, which makes it more expensive for somebody in your home country to buy a foreign product. A quota is when a country will say, you are only allowed to bring in so many of this particular product. So tariffs, a tax, quotas are a number limit on the number of products. Sometimes these are, well, they very rarely will these actually improve society's well-being. Often they're used in an attempt to improve the well-being of society by people who, quite frankly, don't know their economics. Multiple currencies, right? Once again, think about the U.S. If you buy something from North Dakota, it's all the US dollar, but if you're buying something from another country, then you have to deal with different currencies, and currencies do change values, and this causes major issues some of the time, right? If the US dollar rises 10% versus the euro, that means any product we're trying to sell to somebody in Europe is now 10% higher, costs 10% more. That's a pretty big deal. Especially if you're talking about big ticket items like a car. All right, a price of $20,000 versus $22,000 for a vehicle, that's a big difference. And 10% changes aren't that uncommon. I mean, often within a year or two, you can see 20 or 30% changes in the value of one currency versus the other within a couple of years. So you can have some major issues in terms of changing currency prices. Impediments to labor and capital mobility. Once again, within the United States, if you wanted to move to Utah to work a job in Utah, there's no restrictions at all. You don't have to do anything, really. You just pick up, go, and work. There's nothing at all you have to do. Across nations, there are often barriers, and they're often pretty significant that make it difficult to work in foreign countries. Also, it can make it difficult for foreigners to own companies. In some countries, there are some in South America right now that, like socialist dictators essentially, right, as leading the country, there's the risk of expropriation, where the state will literally seize your property if you're a business and try to move in to do business in another country. There's the risk in many countries of the state doing this, and there's the risk of exchange rate variability, as mentioned before. There's two main concepts in terms of, or there's two main phrases we'll talk about that you definitely need to learn as far as our examples for when trade could or couldn't occur. One is absolute advantage, the other we'll talk about in a moment is called comparative advantage. An absolute advantage, if one country is better at producing everything, right? All of the products under consideration, if one country is better at producing all of them, we say they have an absolute advantage in production. The example would like to say CEO here versus a coffee boy. Obviously these aren't countries, but imagine there are two tasks. One is running the company, and the other is getting people coffee. And you have two different people, a CEO and coffee boy. The CEO, well, I don't know how many CEOs you know, but the ones that I've met are enormously talented and enormously hardworking. So, of course, they can run the company better, right? I don't think anybody's trying to think that the CEO couldn't run the company better. But CEOs also are incredibly clever and work their tails off in general, and there's no reason to think that the CEO wouldn't be much, much, much better than the coffee boy at making coffee if that was the CEO's task. But the CEO has far more important things to do, as we'll see. So trade still can take place, but we would say the CEO has an absolute advantage over the coffee boy because we think the CEO could both run the company better, or if they both were tasked with bringing people coffee, I bet we think the CEO could also bring coffee to people better as well. So example of absolute advantage in terms of numbers and across countries, let's think about the US and Bangladesh. And I made up these numbers, but there are a lot of countries where the US will export computers to and will import products like soccer balls from them. So in any fixed amount of time, assume a day, assume the US can produce 10,000 computers and 20,000, or I'm sorry, one or the other, 10,000 computers or 20,000 soccer balls, or any combination in between. Once again, I'm just making these numbers up for the purpose of this example. But so we'll assume US could produce 10,000 computers or 20,000 soccer balls, or in the same amount of time, Bangladesh could produce 200 computers or 10,000 soccer balls. Because the US can produce everything more efficiently, we would say the US has an absolute advantage in production over Bangladesh. If we're talking about computers, right, the US could produce 10,000 computers in a day. Bangladesh can only produce 200 computers in a day. So the US could produce more computers in a day than Bangladesh if that's what they decided to do. Soccer balls. The US could produce 20,000 in a day. Bangladesh could produce 10,000 in a day. The US could produce more soccer balls in any fixed amount of time than Bangladesh. Because the US can produce everything more efficiently, we would say it has an absolute advantage in production over Bangladesh. The question that we're going to explore in our next video is, in part 2 of this series, is could Bangladesh and the US trade in our example? We know the US has an absolute advantage. And at first glance you might think, that means they can't trade. But they can, and we're going to examine why in part 2.